So in this chapter, chapter 6, things are going to be a little bit more common sense because we're talking about production and the idea that um, the problem being that firms need to decide how to use their inputs to make whatever their output good is. And so that's kind of our goal here. So in this case, we're kind of looking at something that we could basically call producer choice. And we're basically looking at how do we utilize inputs to produce the outputs. And the thing is that economists really simplify what inputs are. And we really think that it's just two things, labor and capital. Where again, capital is buildings, machines, um, well, let's just keep it at that. Let's just keep our life simple here. Buildings and machines. Um, Physical things that workers, who are the laborers, work with to produce that output good. Okay. So, this is, as the chapter points out here, is the theory of the firm. So, in other words, we're looking at how um, companies essentially determine the way they're going to produce something that minimizes their cost or maximizes their production levels. And the way that they combine the inputs together, the way that they combine the labor with the capital, that's the technology. So, labor, which would be the workers basically, the capital, that would be the buildings, machines, and then in some cases we have raw materials, water, soil, things from the earth basically. So the technology is how we combine all of these things together. Now, each of these inputs costs something. So there's our constraint, right? It's, you don't necessarily pick the cheapest thing because the cheapest thing might not be that productive. So we're concerned about basically um, how much, how costly a certain input is, keeping in mind how productive it is as well. And so essentially then that gets us through all of these, that we can basically say that the theory of the firm is thinking about what production level we need, how much do we need to produce, and then looking at how to produce that amount in a cost efficient way. So what's our production level going to be, and then how do we produce it in a cost efficient way? Okay. So this question of why firms exist is such an old question. Um, well, it at least dates back to the 1920s. And it goes back to the beginning of what's considered the field of thought considered industrial organization. So an IO, or industrial organization, the idea was that the firm exists because it basically solves a pretty big coordination problem. That if people just produce stuff on their own without any kind of corporation or business kind of directing their activities, things would just be very uncoordinated. Individuals would have to know quite a bit about the market in order to determine what to produce and how to price it. And the business, having a business exist, eliminates a great deal of those coordination problems. Now, the unfortunate part for the worker is that that coordination comes at a cost. That coordination costs something, and that would be that you work for someone else. The business will pay you, but they'll never pay you exactly what you produce for them because the business has to exist as well. They have to get paid, compensated in some way for producing things. Um, the the only kind of way around some of this would be, as kind of the last paragraph kind of points out here, is that you could figure out different ways to pay individuals, right? So I have a salary job, meaning I get paid the same amount whether I meet just the bare minimum requirements of my job or not. My wife, on the other hand, who's in finance, and also should be noted, she works for a firm, a big investment firm, but she's always getting like messages to her to like go independent, right? And so if she went independent, she could basically capture, more income because every transaction generates a commission. On the other hand, by working for a firm, she gets kind of some of the advertising power of that firm. She gets clients from that firm, and in return, she has to give a portion of her commissions back to the firm. But you always kind of have to do this kind of calculation between the two because, yeah, you don't want to just give away money to the company, but on the other hand, there are certain benefits to not being independent. She doesn't have to worry about, she has an assistant that works for her. She doesn't have to worry about like HR issues, right? Like the company handles that. She doesn't have to worry about a lease of her office space. The firm does that. When my wife takes maternity leave, she gets a portion of her some money basically to live on to cover her for maternity leave. If she was independent, she wouldn't have those kinds of things. But when we look at why the firm exists, we have to judge whether it's serving that coordination purpose well enough. As I said, the economist makes things a little simple here by looking at the production story as involving inputs in a very simplified fashion. That there's basically two or three, depending on how you define it, two or three inputs. And that would be labor, capital, and the raw materials. And then those are just defined here. But hopefully, this should be pretty self explanatory and a bit of a review. Now, you've probably seen this kind of production function before, but essentially, um, you've got your amount of capital, you've got your amount of labor, and the functional form of this is the technology. So that's where you see the technology, the way that the capital and labor are combined with each other. And what this production function tells us is how to optimally um, combine capital and labor and minimize your costs. And we would have to look at this differently if it was the short run versus the long run, with the difference between the short run and the long run being that in the short run, there is some input that cannot change, and in the long run, all of the inputs can change. So, why would an input be unable to change? Well, you may have a contract where like a labor contract, where you have to hire your workers for a certain number of years. They have a labor union contract, let's say, or sorry, or I have a contract with, let's say, a steel supplier where I have to accept a certain amount of steel every month, um, or I have a building lease, which means I have to accept that for a certain amount of time. But in the long run, everything can change, which would then mean that our production function would look different